Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted?
Establishing a governance structure for artificial intelligence is essential today. Before committing to any specific technology, organizations should evaluate a potential policy's risks and benefits to create maximum opportunity for successful outcomes. On this episode of We Get AI for Work, we discuss why organizations should set up effective governance structures, form a multidisciplinary governance committee, and develop AI policies to address confidentiality, accountability, and compliance. Today's co-hosts are Eric Felsberg, principal in Jackson Lewis's Long Island office, and Joe Lazzarati, principal in the firm's Tampa office and co-leaders of the firm's AI group. Eric and Joe, given that there are many features to consider when creating an effective governance structure, the question on everyone's mind today is, why should organizations have a structure in place before adopting and utilizing AI technology, and how does that impact my organization?
Thank you, Alicia, and hello, everyone, and welcome back to our next episode of AI at Work. My name's Eric Felsberg. I'm joined by my partner, Joe Lazzarati. How are you, Joe?
Hey, good morning, Eric. How are you?
Good. So, Joe, on this episode, we're going to be talking about creating an effective governance structure, right, when dealing with artificial intelligence. And, this is something you and I have been speaking to a lot of employers about. And, we certainly see how critical establishing a structure is in this space. But, one of the things that I've seen is I don't think that a lot of employers kind of think about, kind of all the features of a governance structure before they jump in and start using some of these AI platforms that are very attractive and more readily available. So, Joe, I guess a good place to start is when thinking about a governance structure, why should we do it? Why should we have a structure in place?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, Eric. It's a conversation that a lot of organizations are having. I think it kind of starts sometimes, some organizations, they may be more developed, and this is how they approach a lot of different technologies. I mean, not just AI is, okay, we have an objective and we want to think about it and what are the risks and how do we best achieve results and how can we measure success? And other organizations see these technologies as, hey, this is a great use, let's just run with it. Maybe they don't have the infrastructure, but I think in either case, I think both organizations, want to maximize the technology. I mean, these AI technologies bring enormous benefits and can help in many ways, but they also come with a lot of risk. I think in terms of, managing data, assessing accountability, liability, compliance. So, if you don't have an appropriate governance around AI, you may not realize many of those risks, and you may not also be able to capture a lot of the benefits that are available.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, and I don't think this needs to be overly complicated either, right? There are some really simple steps that seem perfectly obvious, but sometimes are just completely missed when kind of going down this path. And I think the most simple of them is to take an inventory, right? We are flooded on our emails and everything else about all sorts of new AI tools, and some of them are amazing, right? And you have to think about all the folks in your organization that are also getting those emails and also getting those alerts about a new AI platform. And they may say, hey, let me jump on and let me try this out. And hey, this is great, right? It's really helping me streamline. I'm a lot more efficient. And never think to alert the organization that, hey, I'm using this thing, and may not be completely aware of all the risks. So, we think a good first step is to take an inventory, right, of all the AI tools that are out there, just so you can kind of get your hands around exactly what's being used so that they can be properly evaluated. And speaking of evaluation, who should do that, right? Who's going to own this process? Who's going to do that inventory? Once we get our hands on it and we think about using additional AI tools, who should own that? Should it be IT? Should it be HR? Should legal do that? Maybe there's a compliance function that needs to get involved. So I know, Joe, one of the things that, you and I often talk about and we talk about with our clients is developing a governance committee that would kind of own this function. But, just going back to what I was saying a moment ago, if we do establish a committee, who should be on that, right? Who are the different stakeholders that should be part of this committee?
No, it's a great point. But just let me get back on what you said, because I think it's really important, and it's really happening in a lot of cases about taking an inventory, because it's not just like an inventory of what you're using. I think it's also how you're using it and what happens down the road, right? I mean, we've encountered situations where, and it's not just AI. I mean, it's any managing technology on day one, you may use it for a certain purpose. And then maybe 6 or 12 months down the road, the vendor, if you're using a vendor, offers a different iteration of that tool or a different feature of that tool that comes with different considerations. And the same vetting process that may have happened on day one doesn't happen on day 180 or 360. And those use cases, if you will, or iterations on those use cases don't get the same attention and could create issues. But to kind of help solve that, I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, having some type of a committee or whatever you want to call it, some multidisciplinary group of folks, if that's appropriate to the organization, can really be critical to evaluating it. And I think a lot of, who should be on it. I know a lot of times, at least I'd be curious what you're seeing, but I know that what I see is a lot of times this gets delegated to the IT department for obvious reasons. And I think you have to have IT, but a lot of it is, when you think about governance, is the organization wants to think about, well, what are we going to use it for? What are the use cases? And, because if you're using generative AI to help enhance your marketing function, HR is not going to have as much input there. But at the same time, if you're using AI to help make decisions about candidates, well, then maybe you do want to have HR there. And maybe you don't always want to pull some people in and out as you go. So having someone from IT and having HR and marketing operations and, legal, I mean, there's a lot of different places to look for important stakeholders. But I think it's going to start with, how does the company, what are the objectives of the organization in terms of how they want to use a particular AI application or tool. And that's, to me, a good starting point, at least, to kind of understand who should be involved in the process.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you have to think about, different organizations are going to use AI differently. You mentioned in your comments, right? A lot of organizations, at least, given kind of what the practice we are in, a lot of employers are using it for, personnel selection purposes, right? Can we hire the most efficient person or promote the most efficient candidate or wherever it may be? Others are using it more, to kind of, perform a main element of their business, right? To kind of streamline some of their functions and processes, right? And so I agree in that, we have to kind of think about, or the organizations kind of have to think about, how is this being used? And that will kind of help you put together this puzzle as to kind of who, should be on this committee that we're proposing here to evaluate kind of the use, and not only the AI now that you're using, but future uses. And I would say a lot of the organizations I work with, and again, they're all a little different, but for the most part, look very similar. It's pretty common to to echo what you were saying, to have maybe somebody from legal, human resources. Again, if it's being used for a human resource function. If it's not, it's being used more for a business purpose, maybe having someone from the business, compliance, certainly IT, right? These are the folks that are going to understand kind of a lot of times how these tools actually are operating. So, that's certainly important to have. So, I would agree with that. And, this should not be kind of an insular committee, right? I mean, I think it's a good idea to have, a core group that evaluates these tools, but, they have to communicate with the rest of the organization as to kind of expectations, permissible use cases, impermissible use cases, and so forth. And, you and I, Joe, we spend a lot of time talking with company representatives about kind of reducing all of this and memorializing it into an AI policy, right? Which, this technology is developing so rapidly that it really needs to be, it sounds a bit cliche, but it really needs to be a living document that, is nimble, right? And can kind of change as new technologies evolve. Joe, I mean, in terms of, if we're thinking about coming up with a policy, just in very broad terms, what are some of the features that you would expect to see in an AI policy?
Yeah, I think certainly topics like confidentiality, ensuring accuracy, dealing with company IP, accountability, transparency. These are things that, I'm seeing a lot in policy, but I also want to kind of take a step back and again, just think about, the use case issue and how you may need to drive a particular policy. Just as an example, if you take like an AI tool, maybe it's a dash cam that the health and safety group in an organization decides will be helpful to help, to ensure the safety of drivers and to minimize insurance costs. And these tools have AI capabilities. They might record voices. They might tell whether an employee is wearing their seatbelt. They might be able to understand how the vehicle is being driven and a whole host of really interesting technologies, right? And, it may seem like that's a really important and valuable use case for the company, saves the company money, protects the drivers, protects the public. But HR is never involved in that. And so from a policy perspective, you say, well, how do we make sure that you've gotten appropriate consents if you're recording voices, and what type of data is collected, if any, on those devices? And, if we're collecting biometric information, do we need a consent from the employee if we're doing a facial scan? So the point of is that it just in that situation, if you have one group in an organization that's thinking about this, rolling something out, but has an impact on employees in some way, and HR is never really consulted or legal is not consulted, you really could have some risks. And I think a lot of the inclination is, hey, we want a policy to give to employees to govern, the end user, right? The driver of that truck, right, where the dash cam is used. But there's almost maybe an idea of having an internal policy, right, where you're trying to direct the governance, right, of who the people are who are adopting and implementing these applications to ensure that they're getting and doing all the right things that they need to do to minimize the risk of either developing and in most cases implementing these kinds of technologies. So I think when we talk about policies, there's an opportunity to say, well, yeah, of course we want to explain to employees and explain transparency and confidentiality and IP and getting approval for use cases that they want to use. But then there's that idea of, is there a need to internally have some policy around what individuals and departments in an organization should be doing and how do they go about rolling it out before you get to the policy for the end user employees. So I don't know if that, that's just kind of how I'm seeing some of that develop in terms of managing this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, I think your comments kind of underscore this notion of, as you think through these issues, right, you need to bring in the different stakeholders to help you think through this, right? And, just in kind of, how you just described it a moment ago, right? I'm thinking about, I need folks from the business. I need legal in that situation. I may need HR, and so forth. And on a related note, the employees have to be made aware of how AI is being used and the expectations as it relates to their use of AI, right? And so an important part of this is also thinking about training, right? So once we nail down exactly the AI that we're going to support and monitor and implement in the organization, training employees as to the permissible and impermissible uses of that AI technology. And that really is a critical part of governing this whole initiative. Now, Joe, one of the things, just kind of switching gears a little bit here, that I know that we run up against a lot of times is this kind of, it seems like an age-old question, even though AI is relatively new in our space, about, should we buy an AI platform or should we build something in-house, right? A lot of organizations, more sophisticated organizations may have the talent in-house, right, that can build some of these AI platforms, and they may be very good. And, that opens up a whole nother host of issues for us to think about in terms of the identification of use cases, but also this question of liability, right? So talk a little bit about how we kind of think about this question of liability when you're dealing with either a third-party vendor or you're building a platform within the four walls of your organization.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, I think, that may be beyond the scope of this discussion and can certainly dig into it more in a later episode. But, I ask a lot of times when I'm presenting to HR leaders is, do you feel comfortable being able to evaluate people on your IT team, particularly the ones that are really driving that group? And a lot of times there's some scratching of their head saying, well, no, computers come on in the morning, right? So everything must be working the way we want it to be. Yeah. And particularly in this case, this is complex stuff. The persons who are doing this and developing these tools are they're just brilliant and they really are advancing the ball in a lot of ways. But the ability to understand that and whether it's being done accurately and that we can feel confident rolling it out, that may not be something that internally in the organization they're able to assess, the performance of those tools. So that's a really important component, is understanding your capabilities internally to be able to then make a decision about, outsourcing it or buying, right? But then even if you do use a vendor, I think there's a lot of vendors that are, running to market to take advantage of of a lot of the demand for these tools. And, there's a question about, are they, like any type of product you buy, are they what they say or what they're being promised? So it's really important, and to make sure that if you're doing that, you're vetting those vendors, testing the tool, asking the right questions, getting some help to know what questions to ask. I think those are really important things, because only then can you really evaluate, hey, does it make more sense? We're not finding a vendor that we feel confident about. We feel like maybe we could do it internally, and you kind of have to weigh that. But I think only after really assessing your internal capabilities and then maybe what vendors are doing and what you feel comfortable with, can you really decide. One key question that you also mentioned, Eric, is who owns the liability? And I think that's another big question.
Yeah, and just on that last point, especially when you're using a third-party vendor, right, to provide some of these AI technologies, in our modern world, right, we're often confronted with terms and conditions just in our everyday life, right? You want to download something, you want to use a new technology, you get this terms and conditions, and I think a lot of people, because it a lot of times is from a legal perspective very dense. The everyday person may not want to necessarily trudge through kind of all of these terms and conditions, but when you're implementing an AI tool in the workplace, it's really important, right, that you understand exactly what, from the vendor's perspective, what this AI is intended to be used for, how it's going to be used. Are there liability issues? Have they addressed that in the terms and conditions? And again, it really needs to be scrutinized and, have discussions with the vendors, right? And again, this is a rapidly developing area. And some of the issues that legal may be thinking about, folks on the development side, it may never have occurred to them, right? And vice versa. So certainly important to think about, at least be mindful that that's a potential issue right now. So Joe, before we close out this episode, any last minute comments, words of advice?
Only that there's no time like the present to really be thinking about things. Your organization, you may be surprised, for the listeners there, you may be surprised how many employees may actually be using some of these tools and not even know it. So, yeah. Well, good discussion as always, Joe. And to our listeners, if you have any questions about anything that we discuss, or if there's a topic out there that you've been thinking about and you would like us to discuss it, by all means, please reach out to us. You can email us at ai@jacksonlewis.com, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. So until our next episode, thanks for listening, and we'll be back with you soon.
Thank you for joining us on We Get Work. Please tune in to our next program, where we will continue to tell you not only what's legal, but what is effective. We Get Work is available to stream and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. For more information on today's topic, our presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient.